Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we're impartially breaking down a wildly viral, highly charged Senate clash between Senator John Kennedy and Representative Ilhan Omar. We're going straight to the source material here, a detailed transcript that breaks down the exact arguments, the hard data presented, and the incredible narrative that unfolded right there in the hearing room. My goal is to unpack this source for you, step by step, so you can understand exactly what happened and why it triggered such a massive shockwave across the political landscape. Let's get right into it.
15 seconds. 15 seconds might not sound like much, but in politics, that is an absolute lifetime. And as we're going to explore, this explainer unpacks the exact data, the serious allegations, and the strategic maneuvering that led to what the source actually describes as the longest, most heavily scrutinized silence in recent congressional history. So how on earth did we get to those 15 seconds? Well, let's break it down.
Section 1. Anatomy of a hearing. Let's really set the scene here. We're in room 226 of the Dirksen Senate office building. The cameras are rolling, and the source document points out a completely stark contrast in demeanor right from the jump. It notes that Representative Omar kicked off the exchange by actually calling Kennedy a fossil from a bayou. She even threw in a joke about him tying legislation to catfish subsidies. Now, Kennedy's reaction? The transcript highlights that it was slow and incredibly deliberate. He just methodically wiped his glasses 3 times before opening up a folder to reveal a heavily researched analytical report.
Section 2. The 94% statistic.
So, what was actually in that folder? Well, it wasn't just some standard political talking point. It was built on 7 solid years of Representative Omar's recorded diplomatic positions. Kennedy laid out an analysis drawn directly from UN General Assembly votes, African Union proceedings, and bilateral records, claiming that her legislative voting record aligned with the official diplomatic stances of the federal government of Somalia exactly 94% of the time. The source notes that Kennedy highlighted a profound irony here. He pointed out that even actual elected representatives of the Somali government don't align 94% of the time with their own agendas, simply because governing almost always requires compromise.
And this is where the geopolitical stakes really come into crystal clear focus. Kennedy questioned why an elected American representative would actively block the recognition of Somaliland. Now, Somaliland is described as a stable, pro-Western democratic ally that offers strategic access for the U.S., yet Kennedy argued that Omar consistently opposed its sovereignty, seemingly siding instead with Somalia, a nation the U.S. State Department literally categorizes as a failed state.
Now, to really anchor all this dense geopolitical data, Kennedy deployed this folksy parable about a friend he calls Boudreaux. He told a story about a bank employee who spends every single lunch break at a pawn shop across the street. The punchline? A man who aligns with a pawn shop 94% of the time clearly does not work for the bank. The transcript notes that this moment completely shifted the room's energy, instantly forcing Omar from an offensive posture right onto the defensive.
Section 3. The missing $250 million. Okay, so Kennedy completely pivots here. He takes the confrontation from foreign policy straight into a massive domestic crisis centered around the 2020 Meals Act. The source details how this legislation, which Omar actively championed, broadened meal distribution during the pandemic, but also altered key site inspection protocols. The committee analysis Kennedy brought forward showed that before the Meals Act, fraud detection caught 4.7% of claims. After the changes, that rate plummeted to 1.6%. That is a massive 67% decrease. Kennedy used this specific drop to argue she had dismantled absolutely necessary safeguards.
And the fallout from those altered protocols was just staggering. We're talking about $250 million, money meant for hungry children stolen. 70 individuals went to prison. And maybe the most shocking part? The convicted ringleader of this entire massive fraud, Amy Botch, publicly urged federal investigators to examine Omar's specific involvement in the whole thing. Kennedy made sure to point out that Omar had previously claimed to have absolutely no regrets about the legislation, sharply contrasting her statement with this devastating fallout.
But the narrative in the transcript escalates even further right here. Kennedy brings up a December 2025 U.S. Treasury probe. So this wasn't just about missing domestic money anymore. The Treasury was actually tracing those stolen funds to East African Hawala channels. The assessment concluded that these financial pathways were highly consistent with operational financing routes historically used by al-Shabaab, which is an al-Qaeda affiliate. The transcript notes that Omar responded to this by redirecting the blame toward the FBI.
To drive this all home, Kennedy used another one of his Boudreaux parables. He argued that by dismantling the oversight, she essentially left the proverbial barn door wide open.
And if the neighboring pasture happens to be teeming with wolves, which in this case meant terror networks recruiting vulnerable youth in her own district, well, you bear responsibility for what happens, regardless of whether you claim to have no regrets or not.
Section 4. The loyalty question. This brings us to the absolute climax of the entire confrontation. The focus abruptly shifts from forensic data and domestic fraud to a much deeper, much more profound question of national allegiance. After deliberately noting his own solitary commitment to the people of Louisiana, Kennedy just leaned in. He summarized the 94% alignment, the missing $250 million, the Treasury probe, and then asked her directly, "Representative, who do you represent? Is it the 718,000 Americans in Minnesota's 5th District, or is it someone else?"
And then? According to the transcript, what followed was a highly scrutinized 15-second silence on live television. Instead of firing back an immediate answer like "my district" or "my country," Omar sat there in total silence. The source describes her literally looking up at her Somali-American constituents in the gallery rather than answering the prompt right away.
Kennedy eventually breaks that heavy tension with one final metaphor about misplaced priorities. He says, "A man who spends his time fishing in someone else's lake is clearly not feeding his own family." The transcript notes that Omar then responded with a statement condemning the entire hearing as Islamophobic, though the source makes a point to highlight that she never actually addressed the 94% data or the direct questions about the missing funds.
Section 5. The political fallout. The consequences of this viral confrontation extended way beyond that single hearing room, creating what was basically an unstoppable institutional shockwave. The source outlines a really rapid cascade of fallout. First, it escalated to a bipartisan House censure, with 5 Democrats voting yes, that directly cited that 94% alignment. Then, the Department of Justice stepped in, initiating a strict preliminary review under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, or FARA. And simultaneously, the Treasury Department escalated its own probe by issuing active federal subpoenas to Hawala network operators right in the heart of Minneapolis.
And it wasn't just federal institutions taking action. The domestic, local political repercussions were severe. The DFL party establishment formally backed a primary challenger, citing they needed someone focused strictly on Minnesota. Within her own community, 200 elders signed a formal letter of grievance. On top of that, 11 Somali-American military veterans published a searing open letter demanding a representative who actually keeps their oath to the United States.
But maybe the most powerful response came from her own district's spiritual leadership. The highly respected imam of the Cedar Riverside Mosque released just a single, devastating sentence: "We pray for all of our leaders to remember who sent them." The source frames this as a massive, significant rebuke, showing how her most foundational pillars of support were quietly, but decisively stepping away.
So, what's the ultimate takeaway here? It's how that 94% statistic completely evolved. It went from just being cold forensic data on a piece of paper into a highly effective cultural shorthand. As the source frames it, that single metric became a symbol for a permanent change of address, a narrative of misplaced loyalties that was so clear it required absolutely no partisan spin to understand.
I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought based on the narrative we've explored today. When a political clash centers on hard data versus differing allegiances, what happens to the trust of the 718,000 citizens who are just left waiting for answers? It really boils down to a question of accountability, representation, and how we actually measure a leader's loyalty. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking those hard questions, and we'll see you next time.